As part of this Near Immaculate series of interviews with writers and researchers, we're delighted to welcome today Dr Monica Germana, who's joined us from the University of Westminster, where she's been Senior Lecturer in English Literature and Creative Writing since 2009. And just to give you a little bit of background on Monica, she studied in the University of Viterbo, where she completed a thesis on shared supernatural elements in the work of James Hogg and Emily Bronte. She then received an MPhil in Scottish Studies from the University of Glasgow, where she also completed her PhD thesis. And this thesis really investigated the use of supernatural motifs in the work of contemporary Scottish writers. And her subsequent monograph, Scottish Women's Gothic, a fantastic writing, which we have here, followed, and Monica has since worked on several different projects. She's edited a collection, Ali Smith, with Emily Horton, and she's also editor of a wonderful book called Apocalyptic Discourse in Contemporary Culture, Post-Millennial Perspectives on the End of the World, which is due to be published this month in July. Monica has also published widely in the Gothic, contemporary literature, the city, spaces and places, doubles and monsters. So, welcome, Monica.
Thank you, Tracy. Very kind introduction.
Oh, not at all. But what I suppose the reason why we decided to have this conversation today is that you've written so extensively on Scottish Gothic, and it's an element that we'd like to explore, I suppose, during our conversation today, just to go a little bit deeper into how you define Scottish Gothic and to probe if there's any connection with Irish Gothic. So I guess just to start off by asking you maybe to talk a little bit about what the Scottish tradition is in the Gothic and how you would define it.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. How long have we got?
15 minutes?
It's a very interesting and complex question, of course. What defines Scottish Gothic? Well, if we look at the classics, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or James Hogg's Private Confessions of a Justified Sinner, what certainly emerges from these classic texts is a preoccupation with self and with identity. And I think certainly this underpins much Scottish Gothic, not only the 19th century but also the 20th and the 21st century Gothic cultural production of Scotland. Scottish literature in general is very much concerned with identity and with the notion of its own strangeness, if you like, its own unfamiliarity. It's difficult to define what Scottish is without talking about the difficult relationship with the English counterpart. And yet at the same time, when you take that away, as you may well do as of September, then what does remain of Scottish identity? How do we define it? So I think much of Scottish Gothic, as well as Scottish fantasy really, as Colin Manlove would have it, is really inward looking towards the self, rather than sort of experimenting with what's out there. What I mean is the emphasis is always on the introspective motifs of what defines identity, even when characters do travel to otherworldly destinations, or when they have otherworldly encounters with fairies or vampires or ghosts. The emphasis seems to be always on the self, on the human, on the subject. And there's a quality of a Scottish fantasy and Scottish Gothic which really relates back to what I think is something that we identify with the Celtic otherworld. Celtic otherworld is immanent, is not transcendent, like the Christian heaven, for example. You can see fairies, in the forest, or they live in caves, and ghosts really haunt this planet. They're not on a different planet, or they certainly don't belong to a different dimension. And I think this sort of immanence of the Celtic otherworld has had an impact on Scottish fantasy, where the permeability of boundaries between self and other, as well as this world and the other world, are, it's something that Scottish fantasy and Scottish Gothic places a lot of emphasis on.
And the Gothic, of course, is preoccupied with notions of liminality, but also with notions of borders and transgression between these worlds. And I find what you say very, very interesting, because if you relate it to Irish Gothic, I mean, the Irish Gothic that people normally consider is the very famous Anglo-Irish texts. But these texts are written principally in English, for an English audience, by Anglo-Irish writers. And there's quite a distinct other tradition, as it were. Le Fanu is probably the only person who successfully straddles both, because the other Gothic that I speak of, kind of characterised by the writings of the Bannums, Gerald Griffin, Fitzjames O'Brien, Patrick Kavanagh, to an extent, it's very much based on the rhythms and the storytelling that kind of evolve out of native folklore. And to this day we have this kind of recurrence that happens, and a lot of these, as you say, very fantastical elements, these ghosts, these strange sights, return kind of palpably again and again in an Irish contemporary work by writers like Pat McCabe, for example, that kind of magic realism almost. So it seems that we've already found some common ground between Irish and Scottish Gothic.
Yes. Well, it's interesting what you're saying about the problem with language and the problem between the problem about being stuck between two languages, if you like. Stuck is perhaps not a good word, but certainly this dilemma has underpinned much Scottish debate about identity and nationalism, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. Hugh McDermott tried to promote the idea of a synthetic Scots, so trying to bring back the native Scots, whereas Edwin Muir suggested that Scotsmen will always feel in one language and think in another, suggesting that this sort of dichotomy, this schizoid identity, is really what underpins Scottish culture. And certainly duality is another motif that really pervades Scottish Gothic and Scottish identity. Scotland has always been divided, even internally, not just, between being Scottish and English or British, if you like, but also between Highlands and Lowlands, Protestants and Catholics, in Glasgow, Celtic and Rangers. It's all about, being divided and being fractured.
It's interesting that you locate that discourse in the 1920s, because at that time, obviously in Ireland also, the kind of Irish Republic was starting to emerge, and from the 30s onwards really there's a very kind of keen attempt to define Irishness. Folklore commissions are set up, they start to actively collect authentic tales of Ireland as told in kind of ordinary households, and a whole wealth of information kind of starts to emerge from there on this hidden tradition that has really only been hinted at by kind of Gothic writers, this notion of the otherworldly. But I suppose when we talk about Scotland and Ireland, we can't ignore the spectre, I suppose, of colonialism, and then of the later kind of rich post-colonial tradition. And one interesting aspect, I think, of both colonial cultures is that at certain breakpoints, if you like, in Scottish and Irish history, when kind of periods of exceptional hardship are encountered, we have large bodies of people emigrating, often to huge distances away. Monica, you spent some time in Nova Scotia where you were looking at representations of Scottish
your research.
I did a lot of research in Monica. I knew very well. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because in Ireland there was research conducted in Newfoundland, for example, that found that kind of bodies of myths and legends had kind of been transported there. And very, very similar kind of renditions are still told today. For example, in County Clare and in Labrador in Newfoundland, you have stories like the seal woman and her skin that have survived almost intact. But I'm interested now to hear what happened when you went there and what you found.
Yes, well, it was a very interesting project that I did for my MPhil dissertation, which looked at representations of Scottish culture in Canada, Nova Scotia. This was in 1999, so 15 years ago now. And it was really astonishing to discover, first of all, how although the Scots had actually been in Nova Scotia for a limited period of time compared to the native Mi'kmaq, the French Acadians and the British in general, the Scottish heritage really is really eminent in everything. For a start, the name of the country, the name of the region, I should say, is, you know, obviously New Scotland, even though the Scots, as I say, weren't there for the longest period. However, their culture somehow marked the region more so than the others. The other interesting aspect was how much the contemporary representations of Scottish culture relied on certain, let's say, cliched views of Scotland, particularly those romanticised views of the Highlands, a very kind of rural, land, semi-underdeveloped, but also made of fierce people. The images that you get are of, you know, the immigrant Scots who landed on the Hector wearing their kilts, where historically that would have been absolutely inauthentic, because they wouldn't have been wearing the kilts, because the kilts had been banned at the time. So there's all these kind of inaccuracies that actually create a specific kind of myth and perpetuate a certain kind of myth about the Scottish fatherland. And I use the word fatherland because it is a very masculine way of looking at Scottish identity. The Scottish women don't feature at all. Another interesting aspect is that a lot is made of the Scottish heritage of Halifax in particular. That's where I was based, although the main Scottish part is the Gaelic speaking part, which is in the north of Cape Breton. But in Halifax there are some monuments, including Burns Monument and Scott Monument, of course, you know, again, signalling a certain kind of literary heritage, all pointing towards the Highlands or certain kind of classic aspects of Scottish literature. However, the really authentic monuments that you can find in Halifax that nobody really speaks about are a set of 4 lampposts that you can find in one of the parks of the city. They come from Glasgow. They have the Glasgow coat of arms. They are the only authentic piece of Scotland really that the city owns, and nobody makes a fuss about them because they come from industrial Glasgow, because they come from the lowlands, and they don't belong to that kind of view of Scotland that's more to do with the Highlands and the kind of mythology that's created around that part of Scotland.
Do you think perhaps it's because of the very strong kind of base of mythology in both countries, Scotland and Ireland, that's really lent this kind of utopian vision that seems to have travelled around the world? I'm thinking of the corned beef and cabbage culture, you know. I'm thinking of kind of representations of Irishness and Scottishness and various festivals that go on around the world. But they seem to be always kind of underscored by, as you say, rather cliched representations, but they often refer to mythology, folklore, you know, these very old memories that seem to carry on.
Yes. On one hand, it's certainly, you can visit parts of Ireland and parts of Scotland and think, yes, I mean, I recognise that from the kind of preconceived idea that I have of either Ireland or Scotland, a windswept glen, or, you know, a semi-deserted Munro and stunning views. And of course these things exist, but Scotland is also, especially now, cosmopolitan, it's industrial, it's modern. And it's important, I think, to take into account all the different aspects of a culture. I think the only truth you can say about Scotland is that it is very heterogeneous, and it has different cultures within itself. And perhaps that's what the problem is, when you're trying to channel national identity through fairly narrow parameters, that it then becomes really difficult to really believe in it.
So it seems that when we talk about Irish and Scottish Gothic, we're continually returning to these kind of key ideas of identity, kind of selfhood, home, and what is home, and what constitutes home when home is gone or left behind. So just in terms as well, you mentioned duality a while ago, so I'd like to just finish by kind of asking you a little bit about those themes that you explore in your book, which kind of look at ideas of the uncanny and the divided self and the ghost as very kind of key elements to understanding contemporary Gothic.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said before, I mean, duality is all about being divided, being self and being other, and really accommodating two different aspects of who you are or who you might be within one body or within one nation or within the same kind of community. And the double, of course, flourishes in all cultures that somehow suffer from division or from a colonial experience. It is now quite normal to talk about the migrants' experiences as a hybrid kind of experience, because you feel that you're in between cultures. You're no longer part of your culture of origin, but you also don't belong quite completely to the new culture that no matter how friendly it might be. So
and in your book you kind of relate these contemporary experiences back to the old Gothic tradition, as it were, of Robert Louis Stevenson and
yes,
The Strange Case of Dr Jekyll and Mr Hyde.
Yes, I mean, that text is a real classic paradigm of Scottish duality, the kind of duality that it's in a sense universal, because Stevenson, I don't think, is just talking about Scottish identity. He's talking really about the human predicament in that book, but he's also making specific references, I think, to Scottish identity. You could say the Deacon Brodie, for example, the famous Edinburgh character who was a councillor and a burglar, had this dual kind of life is behind the character of Dr Jekyll and Mr Hyde. And also the very different adaptations that have been made of Dr Jekyll and Mr Hyde really emphasise, particularly the more contemporary ones or the more modern ones, how closely and uncomfortably Jekyll and Hyde sit together. In some versions, for example, I'm thinking of the Victor Fleming even, cinematic adaptation with Ingrid Bergman and Spencer Tracy as Jekyll and Hyde, where the changes are minimal. It's really down to Tracy's interpretation rather than prosthetic or makeup or any other kind of trick. So really it's to do with expression and to do with, you know, the almost imperceptible changes that occur to that character.
And I suppose that's a lot of the real horror of the Gothic as we find it in Scotland and Ireland, is this notion that the other, the colonial other, is after all not so indistinguishable from self.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I think, unfortunately, it's probably all we have time for. We're just starting to probe the edges of this vast commonality.
It was a very kind of difficult question that we tackled, but thank you.
It was, and in a short space of time. So I'd like to thank Monica very much for spending time with us today.
Pleasure.
Hopefully we'll carry on the conversation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.